Hi, I want to talk about trans activism and Scientology. These are both subjects that have interested me tremendously in the last few years, and I believe they're both dangerous cults. I think most people would agree that Scientology is a dangerous cult. In fact, it's probably the most famous cult of all time, certainly the most famous cult in the last 20 years. Trans activism, on the other hand, it may have started out with the goal of improving the lives of genuine, sympathetic, and vulnerable trans people, but it's gone completely off the rails and it's mutated into what is essentially a dangerous cult. The similarities between Scientology and trans activism are really uncanny, and they're numerous, and in some ways you can't tell one apart from the other. And I just want to go through that with you and show you some of the shocking similarities between trans activism and the cult of Scientology. I mean, the first thing is the language itself. Scientologists are a group of people who are obsessed with a mission, and that single mission that unites Scientologists is clearing the planet. Specifically, they want to clear the planet of suppression and suppressive people. Well, that sounds an awful lot like the gender identity theory, trans activist movement of queering the planet and fighting the forces of oppression. Suppression and oppression, clearing, queering, I don't know, it sounds quite similar. What else do Scientologists believe? What exactly are Scientologists? Well, Scientologists are a group of people who are obsessed with revealing their inner true selves, with identifying and purifying their inner true identity and cleansing their physical body of deeply distressing elements that are attached to it by undergoing treatment programs to cleanse themselves. Scientology is deeply hierarchical. Scientology is absolutely full of jargon. Scientologists are disproportionately narcissistic, and they are highly preoccupied with sheltering themselves from suppressive information, and most importantly, are absolutely obsessed with destroying the livelihood of anyone who disagrees with their worldview or might expose them to critical opinions. Scientologists have a deep hatred of psychiatry and psychiatrists, and Scientology is led by people with messiah complexes. And you know what? Every single one of those things can be said about trans activism and the broader gender identity theory that has recently emerged that trans activism is part and parcel to. So, what's next? Where else can we go? Let's talk about the idea of a body thetan and a thetan. So, Scientologists believe that they are something called a thetan. Essentially, the world is filled with these disembodied souls called thetans. And at the moment of your birth, as a Scientologist, the moment of your birth, one of these thetans has attached itself to your body and inhabited it, and you essentially have become that. Your body and that spiritual thetan have fused into one, and now you are that thetan. That is your spiritual embodiment of self. But it was like a race. There were a whole bunch of other thetans competing to attach themselves to that body at the same time, who essentially lost the race. These are suffering disembodied souls, essentially, who have also clung on to the same body, to your body, and who won't let go. So you are a thetan, and you occupy this body, but all these other thetans who got there essentially just slightly after you are still clinging to your body, and they're haunting your body, and they're torturing your body. And part of Scientology is to go through a program of cleansing your body of these body thetans so that you can be a pure, true, clear thetan without the interference of all of this stuff that's going on in your body. Well, doesn't that sound an awful lot like gender identity theory? In gender identity theory, your soul has a true and pure gender. This is the true gender expression that embodies your soul. Except your physical body is covered with markers of other gender identity expressions. You may have been born in a supposedly female body, but if your gender identity soul is male, is truly a guy, then you have to undergo a program to fix your body. You were born in the wrong body, and your body is covered. It's covered with gender expressions that don't align to your gender identity soul and need to be cleansed and purified through treatment. Kind of the same thing. So you might have to undergo a double mastectomy to remove those breasts, which are expressions of the wrong gender identity from your true thetan, your body thetans. Your breasts, they've got to go. And it's the same, it's everything about your body has to be cleansed and obsessed over and fixed through treatment to align with this one true gender identity expression that is your true soul. Isn't that exactly like the idea that your body's covered in thetans and you have one true thetan, which is your soul, and your body is otherwise tainted with these false thetans? It's kind of the same thing. It's quite crazy. Even the language of the way people drift into and then come out of Scientology is like the way people drift into and come out of gender identity ideology. The concept of non-binary, for some people, is sort of an intermediate step. And it's not unlike indie Scientologists. A lot of people get into Scientology really severely, which involves, interaction with the official Church of Scientology and all that entails. And some people become disillusioned with the official Church of Scientology and they want to get out, but they're not ready to completely leave the full ideology of Scientology. So they become independent Scientologists, indies. These indie Scientologists are sort of like opposed to the official doctrines of Scientology, but not yet ready to just completely abandon the whole undertaking. With everything that involves, including the jargon and the friendships and everything else and their whole culture that they've been immersed in. So they become indies. This is sort of an independent step, an intermediate step. And that's kind of like non-binary for a lot of people. See, a lot of these detransitioned young lesbians who had identified as trans man, and then they identified as non-binary, and it was kind of like, it's like an intermediate step between, either on your way towards identifying as a full trans person, but you're not quite ready to commit yet, or very often on your way out. You've been identifying as a trans person and realized it was kind of foolish, and then you're kind of like not ready to abandon the entire trans gender identity theory and all of the jargon and all of the culture and community around that. But you don't feel you're quite a full trans person. You're in the intermediate stage. You're just going by non-binary. You're not ready to just throw the whole thing away yet. It's kind of the same thing. So you're trying, it's just non-binary and indie are phases that people go through on their way out of the ideology. And they parallel each other so closely. So many things are so similar between the two. The narcissism. Scientology is a religion that is all about yourself. It's not like if you're Christianity is a religion about doing good in the world, being judged by God, literally, based on what you have and have not done. So it's just about you doing good by other people's standards. But in most religions, they're kind of like that, I guess. But Scientology is about you. You are a god. And Scientology is about you exploring yourself to deeper and deeper degrees and exposing your true self. So it's very narcissistic. It's very self-focused and self-obsessed and self-oriented. Well, guess what? So is gender identity ideology. The idea that you can just obsess over your gender expression and come to more and more profound truths about your true self. Which don't really, it's kind of circular, that logic, but I don't know. Scientologists often claim that Scientology saved my life. They would never be alive without Scientology. Think of Kirstie Alley. She's a famous Scientologist, and I think she used to be a coke addict or something, and she always said that, if I hadn't discovered Scientology, I'd be dead. Well, honey, there's this thing called rehab. Maybe you could have looked into it. But she had not discovered that rehab existed, so she's decided that the only thing that could have possibly saved her from her cocaine addiction, or whatever it was Scientology. And if it weren't for the fact that Scientology came along, she'd be dead. And you see a lot of that with trans activism, but it just doesn't make sense because not that long ago, there were very, very few trans people transsexual people, and very, very few people who were distressed enough to want to die for lack of access to trans. And now there's just like massive numbers of people identifying as trans, and they're all saying that if I hadn't had access to this identity, I would have died. Well, it's just not the case. The history, every single generation before our generation was not paved with, tons of people suffering and dying because they didn't have access to this massive exposure and to this huge community of gender identity theorists. Like, it just didn't happen. By and large, if you were born in any generation before ours and you experienced gender dysphoria and gender distress, you would have gotten over it and figured out that you're just a gay or a lesbian or a gender non-conforming person who's probably super gay or probably super lesbian. Or you would have gotten over it and figured out that you're just a transvestite, and transsexualism is just an extreme expression of your transvestism. Everybody got over this, and they dealt with it just fine without dying. Like, it just didn't happen. There are very sensitive and distressed trans people who need transition to resolve their distress. That is fine. Be they, people on the autogynephilic spectrum of things, people who, migrate from transvestism to more extreme versions of that, or be they on the gender non-conforming homosexual side of things, like very effeminate homosexuals, males, or very masculine homosexual females who need to express themselves in society and alleviate that distress by transitioning and living the opposite role. That is fine and that is okay. But the number of people who are doing that now, and the number of people who are being encouraged to do that now, this is the difference between a sort of baseline level of genuine sympathetic transsexuals and this massive phenomenon that is being encouraged by trans activism. And that doesn't really connect to the genuine baseline client base, patient base of sympathetic, genuine trans people. But I digress. Let's go back to Scientology. What were we just... censorship, the other big obsession that Scientologists and trans activists share, is an obsession around controlling information. Controlling information other people say, and controlling information that you, as part of the group, can even be exposed to. Oh my God. Trans activists love to absolutely freak out when they're exposed to any information that might threaten their ideology. Any feminist, any lesbian, any gay person, any philosopher or academic or sexologist or clinician, basically any smart person who has any knowledge of the phenomenon of transsexualism, who might want to talk to these activists and explain to them what transsexualism is and how it really doesn't make, how the gender identity ideology that they are framing transsexualism around kind of stupid and doesn't make any sense. They don't want to hear it. They'll just shut it down, can't hear it, obsessively trying to avoid being exposed to any of that information. That is exactly like how Scientologists are obsessed with avoiding any information that would be counter to the Church of Scientology. I mean, us as outsiders, we find it almost impossible to understand how people inside the Church of Scientology stay in the church, because there's so much negative information. It's so damning. It's so obviously a dangerous cult. But they're inside of it, and they're obsessed with policing the information that they have access to and that they themselves will allow themselves to hear. They call it en theta, any bad information. And you know what? People inside the gender identity cult are the same. I mean, some of us are starting to really look closely at what gender identity theorists are actually saying and what these extreme trans activists are actually believing. And it's no less crazy than what Scientologists believe. It's totally out there. But these people within the bubble, they're just they're finding ways to hide themselves from information that would expose them to outside ideas and that would break that bubble. One of the big tools that trans activists love to use is blockers. These are social media blockers. So you could, like Twitter, for example, you're a trans activist, you're an active user of Twitter, you love reading Twitter all the time and posting on it, but you sign up for this app, this program that will connect itself to your Twitter account, and this program has a giant list of anybody who has ever said anything negative about trans activism. and it's a block list. And this program will automatically connect to your Twitter account if you sign up for it and block all those thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of accounts from ever being seen by you when you're on Twitter. It's just like it blocks you from being ever exposed to anybody that's deemed a transphobe. But the people who control these apps, I mean, that's a lot of power to entrust in someone, and they're often not good people. In fact, I think the biggest app, the turf blocker app on Twitter, was created by a guy who is now in jail because he kidnapped and raped and electrocuted and tortured an 11-year-old girl. This was a guy who was a rabid trans activist and rabidly obsessed with, breaking down all the safeguarding boundaries that trans activism does. There's no difference between men and women. Women's safe spaces should be exposed to anybody who wants access to them, and same with girls. Well, guess what? No shit. He was obsessed with all of this stuff because he was a goddamn pedophile who literally kidnapped and raped and tortured an 11-year-old girl and is now going to jail for it. But he also created the most famous, the biggest the biggest blocker, the biggest public list of contraband media accounts that all of these trans activists can sign up to, so that they're never exposed to and theta, to bad viewpoints that would frighten them. And of course, he also used this to hide people critical of, to hide his own identity, to hide the fact that he was a criminal. To shelter the fact that he was being charged and was later charged and convicted of brutally attacking a young girl. To this day, trans activists use this blocker. It's extremely popular. They still believe it's like, well, sure, I mean, fine. So, like, the person who actually created it may be a bad person, but, like, the principle is okay. Seems to be their mindset. No, that's crazy. And Scientology does the same thing. Going back a little bit, an earlier generation, back in the days of CD-ROM drives and desktop computers, remember those? The Church of Scientology distributed a CD-ROM to every Scientologist that they were under instructions to, had a program on it that they had to install on their computer. And that program would do exactly the same thing as these modern day social media block lists. It would block them from ever having access to any media that the Church of Scientology didn't want them to have access to. And they were willingly playing along. Like, yes, well, if you don't want me to have access to it, it's probably transphobic, or in the case of Scientology, and theta. So, they willingly participated in their own censorship, and they granted some person they'd never met before the ability to censor what they had the access to see or not see. Just like trans activists do, willingly, all the time. It's the same thing. And when they're not trying to shelter themselves from hearing unpleasant viewpoints, they're trying to shut unpleasant viewpoints from ever being heard. Scientologists love making scenes in public to attack their perceived enemies. You want to look up the Squirrel Busters, or there are just so many things you can Google. It's just very easy to find rabid mobs of Scientologists attacking their perceived enemies. And you know what else is easy to find? Rabid mobs of trans activists attacking their perceived enemies and vilifying obviously non-dangerous people as monstrous transphobic bigots, trying to shut down conversations before they've ever begun, before anyone has established that what these people have to say is bad or evil. They're there at the gate making sure that, or trying to ensure that these people never get voices from the start. Activists like Kathleen Stock, who is a lesbian philosopher and an intellectual and a feminist and a leftist and by any means a progressive, reasonable person who has some reasonable criticisms around gender identity ideology. Anybody who hears what Kathleen Stock has to say is going to believe her and listen to her and come out with some serious reservations about gender identity ideology, which is exactly why she is ravenously attacked by trans activists. Not because they disagree with her, but they know that if anybody hears what she has to say, they will agree with her. They don't have proper rebuttals. And it's the same with Scientologists who try to shut down their critics. The biggest of all in Scientology is the psychiatry profession. Scientologists despise psychologists and psychiatry. Psychs, evil psychs. They literally have an amusement park like what would you call it? A display. Like they have like a museum of the evils of psychiatry in Los Angeles, I believe it is. It's like a house of horrors of all the ways that psychiatry is just a profession of evil. And it's absolutely batshit crazy. It's nuts. But they really take it seriously. The psychiatrists, psychs, are like basically evil aliens from some evil planet who are out to destroy Scientology. Well, often trans activists have the same attitude about psychiatrists and psychologists. Clinical psychologists who have worked with the trans community for decades and have sort of mapped out the phenomenon of transsexualism have come to some conclusions that trans people themselves don't want to hear about themselves, and have come to some very clear conclusions about transsexualism and what sort of creates it, what its underlying conditions sort of entail, and trans activists don't want to hear it. Gender identity ideology tells trans people that they basically have some special spiritual phaeton of gender. And psychologists and psychiatrists and professionals disagree with that with hard, cold science, so they must be shut down. And there are massive campaigns to destroy the careers of very prominent psychiatrists and psychologists who ever speak out about the reality of the phenomenon of transsexualism. Namely, that it really has a lot to do with sexuality, and it's very connected to sexual orientation and sex drive, and that the desire to be perceived by other people as the opposite sex really doesn't have anything to do with gender bending or even gender nonconformity, but often has a lot to do with something akin to fetish. Fetish, there's that word that terrifies very many trans people and trans activists, trans allies. This unwillingness to confront the phenomenon. So they vilify and attack psychiatrists and psychologists in almost the exact same degree of fervitude that Scientologists do. It's amazing. So I mean, the parallels are stunning. We've got clearing the planet versus queering the planet. You've got, and the jargon. The obsession with jargon. Jargon is very important in any cult because jargon has two powerful roles to play in any cult. Jargon can unite a group, and it can make a group feel special, and it can make a group feel like it's involved in something really interesting and intricate. This is why science fiction and fantasy is all about world building. Like shows like Star Trek, or novels like Lord of the Rings or the Harry Potter series are rich with detail, so that it's like this massive world that you can sort of become obsessed with and really immerse yourself in. Game of Thrones, same thing. Star Trek fans will, they know the minutia about some tiny planet that was mentioned offhand in one episode in some bygone series, because that is what makes the community come together, is the knowledge of all this information and this massive world building project. That's not unlike the massive project of building jargon around a cult. You're all part of some new thing, and you get excited as being part of it. Knowing all the different planets and races in Star Trek is not unlike knowing all the jargon in Scientology. It makes you feel special and a part of something. Or in social justice and trans activist language, knowing all the 117 genders, demigender, demiboy, agender, blah, 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 these preposterous terms. It's just a way of feeling like you're part of a group. But jargon has another powerful role in cults. And that is to supplant regular language and to isolate you from the outside world. Sometimes what happens in jargon is that words that already exist and have meanings in the real world, when you join a cult and get into a cult, they will replace a word's meaning in the real world with its own internal cult meaning. So, I don't know what's an example in Scientology, but let's say suppressive. The word suppression has a meaning in the real world outside of Scientology. It means to suppress something, to press it down, and to keep it back. But in Scientology, the word suppression, that definition has been thrown away. And now the word suppression means opposing Scientology in any way. That's literally, the word of suppressing information is synonymous with opposing Scientology. That's a dangerous replacing of a definition. And that makes it very hard for people in Scientology. It makes it that much harder for them to get out. Because now some of the language they need to get out they literally don't have the words for it anymore. George Orwell had a lot to say about words and twisting their meaning. There's a little novel called 1984 that really goes into that. But Scientology is the same thing. Famously, their transactivism, gender identity, they really go all out about replacing definitions of words. Man, woman, male, female, homosexual, all these words, they're lesbian, their meanings are being completely replaced within the ideology of gender identity theory. Most famously, woman. The dictionary definition of a man is an adult human male, and the dictionary definition of a man to this day continues to be adult human male. But the dictionary definition of a woman used to be adult human female, and now the dictionary definition of a woman, if you're within a gender identity ideology and transactivism, you're not allowed to discuss the dictionary definition of a woman. It's it's a secret. It's taboo to discuss what it means, to the definition of the word. And it's hard to discuss women's rights, and it's hard to just see what you're even doing when you're inside gender identity ideology from the vantage of outsiders, if the very words that you're using don't have the same meaning as what outsiders believe them to mean anymore. So it really can isolate people and make them unable to even see how crazy they sound or how far they've drifted from reality, because the very words they're using, their meanings have been replaced parasitically by other words, and it's not a coincidence. There are so many parallels between transactivism and Scientology. The idea of a thetan being your core essence of being is a lot like the idea of your gender identity being your core essence of being. And likewise, the idea of your thetan being in competition with body thetans that are attached to your physical body is a lot like the idea of your gender identity being in conflict with your physical body and the gender expression and the biological sex of your physical body. So Scientologists have thetans, and they're opposed to body thetans. Gender identity ideologists believe that you have a gender identity in your soul, and your body and your gender expression and your sexed body is the enemy. It's almost the same thing. And the idea of a non-binary person can sometimes just be sort of like an intermediate step on the way in or out of gender identity theory, just like the idea of being an independent Scientologist is a way in or out of interacting with, the Church of Scientology, essentially. The narcissism that is endemic in both communities, the idea that it's the only thing that can possibly save you, and anybody who gets in the way of it, between you and it, is trying to kill you. The absolute ravenous obsession with censorship, and sheltering yourself from exposure to ideas that might frighten you or change your mind, and the absolute madness of trying to shut down speech that you disagree with, and the crazy crowds, and the total obsession with jargon that the transactivist community and the Scientologist community both have their own strange language with weird words and weird, bizarre ways of talking about things that just don't connect with the real word, really. And they replace a lot of words from the real word with their own special meanings within the community. The absolute hatred of psychiatrists and psychologists and anything to do with psychiatric professionalism. Both of them hate psychiatry and psychology for kind of the same reason that obviously the biggest enemy of Scientologists is psychiatrists, because psychiatrists can treat someone and get them out of, out of Scientology. And that's the same threat, I think, to a lot of trans activists. So there's just this ravenous hatred of them. Yeah, the parallels are many and varied, and, in some ways cults have, every time a cult springs up, it's very different from previous cults, but in some ways they all look the same. And I certainly would never have expected that, me being someone who's on the left and who's interested in LGBT stuff, super gay and super progressive, that gay progressive communities would devolve into something deep as irrational and antagonistic and hostile and dangerous and isolated and insular and just toxic as trans activism has. It's just incredibly fascinating to me. I've always been fascinated by Scientology. I've always been fascinated by anything to do with LGBT activism because I myself am a gay man and a gender nonconforming gay man who has experienced some degree of dysphoria growing up. The idea that trans activism and the trans movement has devolved into something as horrifying as Scientology just floors me, and it should floor you too. And if you are a trans activist and you're watching this, you should really think about the parallels with the cult of Scientology. And if you are just an ally watching this, you should really think hard about how, how badly things have gone off the rails. Yeah, I hope I've convinced at least one of you out there. Okay, I guess that's it. Cheers.